Before you go any further, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe veterans deserve more than just a thank you, comment "Respect for Veterans" to show you stand for honor, sacrifice, and dignity. This is the story of Grace Torres, a woman who had served our country with unwavering loyalty, but when cruelty struck, she was about to show the world what true respect really looks like. What happened next shocked everyone in a small-town diner, proving that real heroes are often the ones we overlook. Grace Torres sat in her usual corner of the Rusty Fork Grill, a simple weathered diner known for its cheap coffee and vinyl booths that creaked every time someone leaned back too hard. Grace was no stranger to this place. It was her routine, her safe space. At 45, she was a former Marine Corps staff sergeant, a woman who had served 2 tours in Fallujah. Her first tour was difficult, but her second one cost her much more. Grace lost her left leg to an explosion in combat, and with it, her trust in the world. But what it didn't take was her spirit. The sound of clinking silverware and the low hum of conversations around her were a quiet comfort. Grace wasn't here to stand out. She was here to keep her mind occupied and steady. The manager at the diner was kind enough to give her short shifts during lunch, something she never asked for. Grace wore her Marine Corps pin proudly, and on most days, she was just another quiet woman doing her job, with no need to explain the weight of her past to anyone. She wasn't here to be noticed. She just needed a place to be herself. The people around her didn't bother her much. Some nodded respectfully. Others avoided eye contact, likely because of her missing leg. But Grace didn't mind. She wasn't here for others. She had bigger things on her mind, like the photo in her wallet of her and her unit before the blast. It was the only picture she had left of the life she had before everything changed. The smile in the picture was wider than any Grace had given in years, but she hadn't looked at it in a long time. That is, until today. Today was different. The door to the diner slammed open, the noise startling everyone inside. 3 men walked, in all wearing leather jackets and boots, with vests adorned with patches bearing names like Tank, Goose, and Blade. Their laughter was loud and brash, and they wasted no time making their presence known. Tank, the ringleader, spotted Grace immediately. He made a show of nudging his friends and laughing at her. "Well, look what we got here," Tank grinned, nudging his buddies. "Someone roll in from the VA." Goose chuckled. "Nah, that's Combat Barbie. I bet she's just here for the sympathy tips." Grace didn't flinch. She simply kept folding napkins, setting them down with the quiet precision of someone who had once assembled rifles under fire. She had heard worse in war zones. Insults didn't hit the same. But in a place like this, where people looked away, instead of standing up, they carried a different weight. "Do they have kitchens for you back at the VA?" Tank mocked. His voice boomed loudly in the small diner. Grace didn't respond. She simply continued her work, measured and controlled. But Tank, clearly not satisfied with just words, had something else in mind. Blade stood up suddenly and walked toward her. "You deaf soldier girl," Blade slurred. "We're talking to you." Grace glanced over her shoulder, not in fear but in calculation. Blade was bigger than her, but sloppy, the kind of threat you don't engage unless forced to. He reached for the handles of her wheelchair and with a sudden jerk, pulled it forward violently. The front wheel clipped the leg of a nearby table, and the tray of food in Grace's lap went flying. Hot coffee splashed against her arm, and a fork skittered across the floor. The sound of her body hitting the ground hard was something Grace hadn't heard in years. Her right leg twisted underneath her, the prosthetic bending awkwardly as pain lanced through her hip. The diner went silent. A busboy froze mid-step, and the waitress behind the counter gasped but did nothing. A couple near the window stared into their drinks. No one moved, no one spoke. Tank, Goose, and Blade laughed. It wasn't loud, but it was meaner, quieter, satisfied. Grace lay on the floor, still, her hands pressed against the sticky tile, coffee soaking into her jeans. Her wallet had spilled open nearby, and a folded, faded photograph slipped out. A photo of her unit, standing proud in the desert sun before the blast. Someone had written on the back in permanent marker, "She carried us every damn time." Grace didn't cry. She just stayed there for a moment, still as the diner held its breath. It was a feeling she'd grown all too familiar with in the past. But now, as she pushed herself up slowly, something was different. The pain didn't matter. The laughter didn't matter. Her hands, though calloused, moved with the precision of someone who had seen war, someone who had been through hell and made it out the other side. She didn't need help. She was used to doing things on her own. Her jaw locked as she moved. Her hands carefully, the same hands that had once carried rifles and saved lives. She righted her chair with a firm motion, climbing back into it like she had 100 times before. The pain in her leg, the coffee-soaked uniform, none of it mattered, but for the first time in years she was feeling something else. Something she hadn't felt in a long time, respect. As she sat back down in her corner, the atmosphere in the diner changed. The bikers laughed less. They began to shrink back, like their own words were suddenly too heavy to carry. No one helped Grace. No one stood up. But there was a boy in the corner, about 9 years old, who had seen everything. And when he asked his father, "Is that lady a soldier?" the answer that followed would change everything. His father, a man wearing an old campaign hat from Desert Storm, stood and walked toward the door. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Outside, the light had turned golden, and the town lay quiet in its afternoon lull. "I need to report something," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "This concerns one of ours." He paused. "Send a team, trust me." Grace Torres sat quietly, her hands still in her lap, her mind racing as the minutes passed. The noise in the diner had died down to a dull murmur. The 3 bikers had returned to their booth, but now their laughter had lost its bite. Tank, Goose, and Blade had grown quieter, almost self-conscious. It was as if the air around them had thickened, becoming heavier with each passing moment. Outside, the sound of tires on gravel cut through the quiet afternoon. A military green SUV rolled up in front of the diner, dust swirling around its tires like a sign of something bigger than the small-town, run-down diner. The vehicle stopped with authority, and when the door swung open, 3 Marines stepped out. The first was a master sergeant, barrel-chested with grey hair, walking with a slight limp and leaning on a polished cane. His eyes scanned the diner, assessing the situation like he was checking a perimeter. The second was a younger Marine, tall and clean-cut, pushing an empty wheelchair. The third was a female captain, her uniform adorned with a row of ribbons and combat medals that shimmered under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights. The moment the door opened, the entire diner froze. No one spoke. The room went still, as if time itself had paused. Even the waitress behind the counter, who had been wiping a sugar dispenser, stopped in mid-motion. Goose dropped his knife, and Tank blinked in confusion as if he didn't understand what was happening. Grace, however, remained steady in her wheelchair, her posture tall, despite the strain of the day's events. The master sergeant approached her table with firm, purposeful steps. He stopped in front of her, and without hesitation, he offered a textbook salute. The gesture was as crisp and precise as if he had just stepped out of a military parade. "Staff Sergeant Torres," the master sergeant said, his voice gravel and steel. "Forgive our delay." Grace's eyes met his, and for the first time that day, a spark of recognition flared within her. Her response came without hesitation. She returned the salute with precision, her eyes no longer clouded with the discomfort of the moment, but filled with a quiet strength. The silence in the diner was thick, as if the room itself had gone still in respect. Even the bikers, who moments ago had been so loud and brash, now looked down at their plates, too ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. The captain stepped forward, her gaze landing squarely on Grace before shifting to the three men sitting at the booth. "We received a call from one of ours," she said, her voice calm but firm. "He said a decorated Marine had been publicly harassed on civilian ground." Her gaze flicked to the bikers, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as she assessed them. Tank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Goose avoided eye contact, while Blade, who had been the most aggressive of the three, shifted his position as if realizing his actions had just been called out for the world to see. The captain continued, her tone unwavering, and that physical assault was involved. Grace shook her head slightly, as if trying to downplay the situation. "It's nothing," she murmured, but the master sergeant would have none of it. His voice rang out loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "With all due respect, Staff Sergeant, it is not nothing," he said, his words like a declaration of war against the injustice she had just suffered. "Nobody touches one of ours, not in combat, not in peace, not ever." The younger Marine stepped forward, his eyes locked on the bikers. He was tall, lean, and his posture spoke of the discipline and training that only a Marine could possess. He spoke clearly and with authority. "Staff Sergeant Torres led our unit through Fallujah," he said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared history. "She pulled 3 men out of a Humvee after it was hit. I was one of them." Recognition dawned on Grace's face as she looked up at the young man. "Private Jenkins?" she asked softly. "You're a corporal now, ma'am," he nodded, his voice steady. "Thanks to you." At that moment, the diner's atmosphere shifted. It wasn't just the Marines standing tall in the center of the room that had everyone's attention. The quiet dignity and respect that radiated from them spread like wildfire. A young boy, no older than 9, who had been sitting with his father, stood up slowly. His wide eyes had been fixed on Grace since the moment the bikers had begun to harass her. His father, a middle-aged man in a weathered ball cap lined with old campaign patches, stood beside him. "Dad," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is that lady a soldier?" His father turned, his eyes meeting Grace's with a quiet nod. "Yeah, Tommy," he said, his voice calm. "She's a real one." And just like that, the whole room shifted. One by one, patrons of the diner began to stand, offering their own silent gestures of respect. An elderly man in a Korean war cap stood, offering a quiet salute. A woman near the door followed, and then 2 National Guard members, dressed in civilian clothes, stood. Within seconds, half the diner had risen to their feet. Everyone stood, their shoulders squared, their backs straight. They were silently telling Grace that she was seen, that she was one of them. The bikers who had once owned the room with their laughter and loud voices now sat quietly, shrinking under the weight of the respect filling the air. Goose sank back into his booth. Tank looked away, and even Blade remained silent, his earlier bravado gone. For the first time, the bikers didn't own the room. Grace did. The air outside had turned to a chilly evening breeze, the sun dipping behind the Montana hills, casting a warm golden glow across the town. The diner, now a sanctuary for respect and dignity, remained quiet for a while. The sound of footsteps from the parking lot slowly grew louder. It was as if the entire town was holding its breath, knowing something important had just happened, something that would not be forgotten. The front door of the diner opened again, and the military green SUV rolled back up to the lot. The tires crunched against the gravel, sending small dust particles swirling into the air. As the vehicle came to a halt, everyone knew that something bigger was about to unfold. A new chapter for Grace had begun. The door swung open with military precision, and 3 Marines stepped in, their posture as impeccable as ever. The first to enter was a master sergeant, his barrel-chested frame and grey hair making a striking impression. His eyes swept across the room, scanning the diner with the quiet authority that only a seasoned officer could possess. Behind him, a younger Marine pushed an empty wheelchair with precise steps. The third member of the group, a female captain, walked in with a powerful presence. Her uniform gleamed, adorned with rows of ribbons and combat medals. She was a figure that commanded respect. The moment they stepped inside, the room went still. It wasn't just the sound of their boots on the floor that made the diner quiet. It was the energy they brought with them. Grace Torres had felt the room's energy shift as soon as they walked in, but now the change was undeniable. Grace, who had been sitting in the corner of the diner, tucked away like a forgotten soldier, now felt her body stir with the slightest sense of hope. These weren't just any Marines. These were her brothers and sisters, and they had come to stand by her, just as she had once stood by them. The Master Sergeant stepped forward, walking straight up to Grace's table. His eyes never wavered from her, his every movement precise. His hand rose in a perfect salute. "Staff Sergeant Torres," he said, with a voice that sounded like gravel mixed with steel. "Forgive our delay." Grace's response was immediate. She snapped to attention and returned the salute with military precision. Her hands were steady, her jaw clenched in respect. Her face was serious, but her eyes, for the first time since the incident, sparkled with something that hadn't been there before: recognition, respect, and most importantly, the feeling of not being alone. The Marines behind him stood silently, their presence creating an invisible shield around her. The air inside the diner was thick with unspoken words, the tension from the previous moments dissipating in the face of true honor. The female captain stepped forward next, her tone calm yet firm. "We received a call from one of ours," she said, her eyes moving slowly, deliberately to the bikers. "He said a decorated Marine had been publicly harassed on civilian ground." The bikers froze, no longer the loud, disruptive force they once were. Tank, Goose, and Blade, all of whom had taken so much pride in their bullying earlier, now shrank in the presence of those who truly understood what it meant to be in the service. The captain's voice remained level, but it was sharp as she addressed the room, and that physical assault was involved. Grace, her voice barely above a whisper, responded, "It's nothing." But the Master Sergeant wasn't having it. His voice rang out, deep and resonant, as he spoke to the entire diner, loud enough for everyone to hear. "With all due respect, Staff Sergeant, it is not nothing," he said, making his presence known. "Nobody touches one of ours, not in combat, not in peace, not ever." The younger Marine stepped forward next, his posture strong and unwavering. His eyes locked onto the bikers. He was a reminder of the bond that had brought them all together. "Staff Sergeant Torres led our unit through Fallujah," he said, his voice steady. "She pulled 3 men out of a Humvee after it was hit. I was one of them." Recognition lit up Grace's face as she looked up at the young Marine. "Private Jenkins?" she asked softly, her voice full of disbelief and gratitude. He nodded. "Corporal now, ma'am," he said, his voice full of respect. "Thanks to you." A silence fell over the diner. The realization of the weight of Grace's actions, the sacrifices she had made, hit everyone in the room. A young boy, barely 9 years old, stood up and asked his father a question that carried more weight than he knew. "Dad," the boy whispered, "is that lady a soldier?" The father, a man in a worn jacket lined with campaign patches, didn't hesitate. His response was filled with admiration. "Yeah, Tommy," he said softly. "She's a real one." And just like that, the moment transformed. The bikers, once brash and arrogant, sank into their seats. Goose lowered his eyes. Tank averted his gaze. Blade was silent for the first time all day. The patrons of the diner, who had been silent observers, now stood, their bodies rigid with respect. one by one, from the elderly man with a Korean War cap to the two National Guardsmen who had been sitting in civilian clothes. The people in the diner rose to their feet. The bikers no longer owned the room. Grace did. The next week, the diner had changed. The old sign, which had read Rusty Fork Grill, was replaced by a new wooden one, Homefront Cafe, where respect is always on the menu. Inside, the transformation was subtle but powerful. A framed display now hung on the back wall, showcasing local veterans' photos, their names and their service years. A small plaque was placed above Grace's booth, reading, "All gave some gave more." Grace still came in every afternoon, folding napkins and serving coffee with quiet precision. But now her Marine Corps pin was no longer tucked beneath her collar. She wore it proudly on the outside, and a small American flag patch was taped to the back of her wheelchair, a reminder of the sacrifices she had made and the respect she had earned. The manager, Dave, had changed too. He wore a pressed shirt, now a tie with a small flag pin on his collar. He had hired 2 more veterans to work at the diner, recognizing that they deserved the chance to build a life after serving their country. Each Thursday, the Marines returned, their green SUV pulling, into the lot at exactly 1800 hours. They sat at Grace's table, sharing coffee in silence, a tradition that had started that day and continued as a reminder of the bond that could never be broken. Grace, once invisible in the corner of the diner, had become a symbol of the respect that veterans truly deserved. A diner, a town, and a woman had all been reborn that day. And as for the bikers, they never returned. Rumors spread that they had been fired after their actions that day, their names and reputations forever tarnished. Grace never asked. She had far more important things to focus on now, like the young recruits who came to the diner, the veterans who started wearing their medals again, and the simple joy of being seen. At the Homefront Cafe, respect was always on the menu. And for the first time in years, Grace Torres had found a place where she truly belonged.